Good morning, everyone. I'm Jill O'Donnell, Director of the Clayton Yeutter Institute of International Trade and Finance here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I'm really pleased to welcome all of you here today for this year's symposium, including all of those who are joining us online this morning. And I'd like to offer a very special welcome to our speakers who are going to enlighten us quite a bit today, I think. I'd first like to briefly acknowledge the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group Foundation for its support of this symposium, which the Yeutter Institute hosts every other year in honor of Clayton Yeutter, who served as the president and CEO of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange from 1978 to 1985. He also served as U.S. Trade Representative under President Ronald Reagan and U.S. Secretary of Agriculture for President George H.W. Bush. Clayton Yeutter's legacy forms a very strong foundation for the Yeutter Institute, where we are training the next generation of students, many who are in the room today and will be coming and going this morning, to think critically about international trade and about where the trading system is heading next. The theme of today's symposium is Toward a New International Trading System. This reflects longstanding pressures on the system, such as those that led to the collapse of the World Trade Organization's appellate body, for example, in 2019, which means that countries can appeal decisions about trade disputes into a void where they will remain indefinitely in limbo, since there is no panel of judges to hear those appeals. It also reflects more recent trade policy changes. Over the last year, we've seen the United States impose new tariffs on every country, then a flurry of negotiations with numerous trading partners, leading to agreements on reciprocal trade that are unlike traditional free trade agreements. In February, the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated many of those tariffs, and new tariffs were subsequently announced under separate laws. So we really are heading somewhere new, but we're still on the way there, and we don't know what the destination looks like yet. However, we have here today several people who I think can give us a pretty good idea of where we may be headed. They have negotiated trade agreements, they have steered their passage through Congress, they've spent lots of time in the halls of the World Trade Organization, they've studied trade's impacts on the US economy, the global economy, and on agriculture, and they have led a large company's response to new tariffs as well. To read their full biographies of all of our speakers, I'd like to direct you to the QR code on your programs that you can scan to read all about their many credentials that are too numerous to recite here this morning. So please feel free to view them on our website using that code. To kick off our discussion this morning, I am very pleased to introduce Julie Callahan, the Chief Agricultural Negotiator of the United States. In this position, Ambassador Callahan works to promote the interests of U.S. farmers, ranchers, and food manufacturers, including through conducting negotiations on tariff and non-tariff barriers, addressing agricultural issues at the World Trade Organization, enforcing ag-related provisions of trade agreements, and opening markets for U.S. agriculture. Previously, she held senior positions in the U.S. Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Ambassador Callahan is joining us virtually this morning here in just a moment. So I'm welcoming her and would like to turn it over to Ambassador Callahan.
Really pleased to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you. I wish I could be there in person. It's really a pleasure to be here to kick off this symposium on such an important and timely topic. This is something that we are working day in and day out on, transforming and modernizing the international trading system to ensure that trade really is fit for purpose, given the geopolitical constructs of today. And in the context of the current changes and the challenges that we're facing in international trade, I wanted to provide a few insights into the America First trade policy, its role in the necessary transformation, not only of the US domestic approach to trade policy, but also to the international trading system as a whole. And we've just crossed the 1-year mark since President Trump imposed the reciprocal tariffs. That was April of 2025. Those tariff actions at that time and still are intended to restore fairness in our trading relationships and to address our ballooning, unsustainable global goods trade deficit. That includes really an out of control agricultural trade deficit that has been growing over several years. Now, prior to this administration, and for many years, I can tell you from experience, I've been at USTR a little over 10 years now, many of our trading partners have behaved as if they actually have a right to access the US market. No matter how poorly they treated our companies, no matter how poorly they treated our farmers, they felt, the US market is open and they're good to go, regardless of their treatment. President Trump really began to communicate to countries, and it was really a wake-up call to our trading partners that wasn't really going to be the norm moving forward. And that did create some unprecedented leverage for us at USTR to seek deals with countries that do want to maintain access to our market. We have one of the most attractive, if not the most attractive market in the world, and countries do want access. And to get that, they just need to treat us fairly. It's really as simple as that. So over the past year, we've really completed a fundamental reset of our trade relationships. Our trading partners understand what the deal is now, and the reset really is bearing tangible results for US agriculture. I will say, in many ways, in the context of the multilateral space, we're really catching up for 30 years of lost time. And with the WTO, the World Trade Organization in particular, I was in Cameroon last month for the 14th Ministerial, or MC14, as it's called. And just prior to that meeting, first in December, the United States circulated a very important document regarding WTO reform that laid out the US proposals and ideas on how the WTO could reform. And several WTO members then circulated their ideas on reform. So that's really how it should be. Members were sharing ideas, how to reform the institution, and with a full acknowledgement across the board, WTO members know reform is sorely needed. We want to ensure that the WTO remains relevant. So that was really part of the two documents that the United States, first in December and then right before MC14, we circulated a second reform document, really with the intention of getting some traction and making good progress in Cameroon. What we actually encountered on the ground in Cameroon was, frankly, a lack of seriousness, a lack of willingness regarding the need for WTO reform. Certain members really doubled down on some of the paralysis that we had been experiencing for many, many years, particularly in agriculture, signaling no reform, no new ideas until you give us what we want. That's paraphrasing, but essentially that was the position of certain members coming in. And then other WTO members had a position, reform is fine, new rules are fine, but count me out because I need flexibilities. And while we're at it, I'd like to roll back my existing WTO commitments. So with those kind of sets of positions, it made for a very difficult ministerial conference. And it's important to also note that roughly 3/4 of the WTO members aren't obligated to follow some of the agreed upon trade rules. And not just the new rules, but there's also a constant refrain seeking carve-outs even from existing obligations, and then wanting carve-outs from any new obligations as well. So the United States, of course, we have a position that flexibilities are needed. For instance, least developed countries need flexibilities on implementing certain commitments. That's certainly the case. But it's also important to recognize that in terms of the functioning of the WTO as an institution, there are certain members that are telegraphing they don't ever intend to follow the rules. They just feel that they will be part of creating the rules that others will follow, but the rules really don't apply to them. That's actually in addition to certain members like China and India that flagrantly flout the rules with really no consequences. So we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for the negotiating function of the WTO when 3/4 of the negotiators in the room are negotiating commitments that they don't consider applicable to themselves now or even in the future? And a great example of that is the members that want to negotiate on agricultural domestic support, but not their own domestic support. They just want to negotiate on how to limit US and other developed countries' domestic support. And so I'll just kind of put a pin on that just as a foundational challenge in the multilateral space where members, the majority of members don't believe that the rules apply to them. And maybe some of your other speakers today will get into this challenge more. But back to on the ground in Cameroon, in the end, at the end of the ministerial, there was no agreement on the e-commerce moratorium. That was something that the United States had seen as low-hanging fruit, given that agreeing to extend the moratorium. Initially, we wanted a permanent moratorium. We compromised greatly and said, let's go for 4 or 5 years. That agreement would not have required any members to change their current policies because there is an existing moratorium in place. Even that couldn't get over the finish line. So the e-commerce moratorium failed. The WTO reform initiative failed, but the failure of MC14 really extends beyond just the lack of outcomes at the ministerial. What happened and what we saw at the ministerial was most WTO members were not represented by their trade ministers in Cameroon. There were some vice ministers, in some cases, lower level officials, and that really says a lot when a country sends a delegation to a WTO ministerial, but it isn't worth their trade minister's time to be there in person. And so what we saw in Cameroon, it wasn't an aberration, but really the next step in a deterioration that the United States has been tackling and trying to reverse for many, many years now. For many, many years, spanning administrations that the United States has been tackling this. And so with that in mind, we are not abandoning the WTO. On the contrary, we are still actively engaging. We'll continue to do so. A number of committees are the bright spots, the SPS committee and others that are doing excellent work. But we also are not going to be constrained from pursuing our own path forward. And so shifting gears slightly, I wanted to also share my perspective on how important and profound the shift in US trade policy has been over the past year, both in terms of our bilateral negotiations, but also our multilateral relationships, and specifically within agriculture. If you look at the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, that is more than 30 years old. You know, it entered into effect in 1995. And under that agreement, WTO members took on obligations, including binding of tariffs. And so agreeing not to raise their tariffs higher than a particular bound rate. And different countries' bound rates are different based on their circumstances at the time of the negotiations. So to give you a few examples, the United States has a bound rate of 5% on agriculture. This is our average bound agriculture rate is 5. The EU is 11. Vietnam is 19. India is 113. Norway is 138. And Nigeria is 150. So that's sort of the snapshot spectrum of certain average bound ag tariffs under the Agreement on Ag in the WTO. And generally, members apply lower tariffs than their bound rates. So if you look at average applied ag tariffs for the same set of countries, the US still 5. So our average applied is the same as our average bound rate. The EU is 10.5, Vietnam is 17, India is 37, Norway is 30, and Nigeria is 16. So getting into the weeds a little bit, but this is to illustrate some of the challenges that we have faced, both in the WTO, where countries are very happy with their high bound tariffs. They really do not have a lot of motivation to lower their own bound rates, despite the mandate in the Agreement on Agriculture to continue to negotiate, including to decrease tariffs. And for years, the United States has signaled we are willing to negotiate domestic support in concert with negotiating ag market access. The two are really two sides of the same coin. But other members really have refused to negotiate market access, resulting essentially in paralysis of the WTO agriculture negotiations. Now, shift to 2025, when the president expressed his view that the multilateral trading system was not fit for purpose, resulted in large, persistent trade deficits for the United States. And if you look at the WTO ag negotiations as a snapshot, that really illustrates just how right that messaging was. And if you look at the extension from the WTO into our bilateral market access negotiations, imagine we're sitting across the table. I'll use India as an example, and we're negotiating ag market access. Now, our average applied rate is 5. India's average applied rate is 37. And so if we want India to liberalize its tariffs to provide us with additional ag market access, they want to be paid and they want us to offer something of equal value in exchange. But our rate is already down at 5. There's really not a lot we can offer in the ag space. And so traditionally, that created a situation where ag market access wins had to be balanced by industrial goods concessions. And that was because of the very unlevel playing field from the get-go in our ag negotiations. So the reciprocal tariffs, I know there's a lot of views and a lot of emotion about reciprocal tariffs, but for agriculture negotiations, they truly have been a game changer for us. Aside from getting tariff concessions, leveling the playing field means constantly tackling unfair trade practices. That's the unjustified non-tariff barriers, and ensuring as a baseline that trading partners are treating us fairly. And many of you, I know we have an audience of trade nerds here, so many of you probably know and are familiar with the USTR National Trade Estimate Report. I call it the encyclopedia of bad behavior. It outlines all of the actions, all of the unfair trade practices that our trading partners are committing, not just agriculture, but across the board. And previous administrations, USTR staff have expended countless time and effort, long hours, nights and weekends addressing the issues in the NTE report. And certainly there have been discrete wins along the way. But once we had the leverage of the reciprocal tariffs in place, that really created a situation unlike any situation in USTR history, where the leverage of the reciprocal tariffs helped us to negotiate really very meaningful commitments, granular commitments from trading partners to remove the unjustified trade barriers and to provide market access concessions as well. And so in the past year, we concluded 9 agreements on reciprocal trade, also 9 framework deals that outline the contours of agreements on reciprocal trade that we are currently finalizing. And these really do provide sort of FTA level commitments on very specific trade concerns and market access, liberalization. Amazing when you think 9 are over the finish line, 9 are kind of in a solid place where we're working to finalize, and compare that to all of the FTAs since 1985, total 14 free trade agreements. And I know they're different, they're very different, but the progress that we have been able to make this year really has been pretty revolutionary in terms of addressing some of our really long-standing challenges with trading partners. And so that brings me to, I'm sure many of you are wondering about the Supreme Court ruling and the effect on the current negotiations and our current leverage. I will say we still have the Section 122 tariffs that are in place. So we have not slowed down in terms of our negotiations with trading partners. We have one big trading partner is here with us in DC right now in negotiations as we speak. And also USTR is pursuing a number of Section 301 investigations into trading partners' unfair trade practices. So while there are a number of legal authorities for the president to impose tariffs, as Ambassador Greer has said, the tools may change. You know, the legal mechanism for the tariffs may change, but our trade policy has been and still remains consistent. And so looking ahead, the new trading system that we're envisioning will be a restoration of fairness and balance to U.S. trade relationships and bringing that fairness and balance into our WTO conversations as well, and with an eye toward meaningful WTO reform so that the institution can remain a vital institution and bring back the negotiating function and restore the WTO to the organization that it was meant to be. And right after MC14, you probably saw Ambassador Greer had a number of pieces in the press and noted that the United States is charting its own course on trade policy. We're working regionally, bilaterally, unilaterally where necessary, and driving reform on trade globally, tackling the tariff and non-tariff barriers, the unfair trade practices, the structural imbalances that currently exist, and importantly, diversifying and securing our supply chains, that is. Change isn't easy, of course, but in this case, it's really necessary. And in the end, we do see that an improved international trading system really will work for the better across the board globally. So that's my remarks, and happy to answer a few questions. I know I started a bit late, so if we don't have time, I understand, but thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you virtually.
Thank you, Ambassador Callahan, for that very concise and informative rundown. We do have time for a couple of questions, so if anyone has one, please raise your hand and wait for the mic to be run over to your table. I'll ask one while you're thinking. Ambassador Callahan, I wonder, you mentioned the 9 ARTs and the 9 framework deals. Could you just share where you see the biggest wins for agriculture in particular in any of those deals?
Absolutely. The first set of deals, it's really a broad spectrum of countries. Cambodia, small developing country, they fully liberalized all of their ag tariffs for US agriculture from the get-go, even before we had signed the agreement itself. And that agreement really has a lot of promise, not just for US ag stakeholders to potentially grow market share, but also for Cambodia as well. And so some of the agreements really are signals of strengthening our partnerships and diversifying our supply chains. And then going through the spectrum, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, and Indonesia are major growing expansive markets with growing middle class. US ag stakeholders have wanted to expand market access in this region, Southeast Asia, and many of the non-tariff barriers have prevented us from improving our market access. And the arts, as we call them, address the major trade barriers that we have been tackling literally for decades. And then you get to our agreement with Taiwan, where that really is an FTA level agreement in terms of the ag market access, also addressing some of the non-tariff barriers, for instance, on beef, pork, and potatoes, that likewise we had been tackling for decades. And now we're in a position where these commitments, the countries are making regulatory changes, they're changing their tariff schedules, they are making good on all of the wins that we got on paper. And so this is sort of the first 9 offer a big span, Ecuador, Argentina, Western Hem countries, Southeast Asian countries. Some of the future ones we want to make sure we get done are, with the EU, with the UK, with other African countries that we have not made as much progress yet, but we intend to. So it really is a reset across the board of our trade relationships.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Ambassador Callahan? Cindy, back here.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's an honor to be in this room and hear from you today. I have a couple questions. China has designated themselves as a developing country in the WTO. Other countries have the advantage to do the same. What policies govern a self-proclamation of a developing country and all the privileges that go with it?
That is an excellent question, and it really is something that we are actively grappling with. Not just the United States, but across the WTO, there is a recognition that the acronym is SNDT, so special and differential treatment, that developing countries require. There are least developing countries that really do need some additional flexibility in order to get them up to a position where they're able to fully commit to certain types of commitments. But really, if a country has a space program, really, can they not follow a science and risk-based approach to SPS measures? So really, there's such a wide spectrum of countries that are self-designated as developing. Some countries have removed their self-designation as developing. In particular, once it was fully clear, and I think there was a little bit of shaming involved, that they admitted, okay, we're not developing. And even China has agreed not to use the flexibilities of a developing country for certain new commitments that are being negotiated. The challenges with China in the WTO, though, beyond whether it's a developing country, relate to its non-market economy status. And so some of the foundational rules of the WTO really have been insufficient to address some of the behaviors that we see from China and other non-market economies where they just don't follow the rules and there aren't mechanisms in place within the institution to really address some of the challenges that the market economies face in trading with these countries.
Thank you. We have time for another, if there is one. I'll go back there to Cicely. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, Ambassador. Thanks for joining us. My question is around the, I guess, the plan for the reciprocal tariffs. Is this a long-term strategy for the rest of the Trump administration, or will the USTR find themselves, satisfied, I guess, with the progress that you're making on trade agreements where maybe you'll start pulling back some of those? Thanks.
That is a great question also. I will say that the current trade policy of restoring reciprocity and balance, I don't see going away. And there is evidence that the policies that have been in place for a year are actually resulting in tangible benefits. So if you look at January of 2025, that month alone, the United States had a $6.5 billion agricultural trade deficit with the world. That was, the month of Inauguration Day. So January 2025, $6.5 billion. We were projected to have a continually ballooning agricultural trade deficit, despite in the past having a very substantial agricultural trade surplus. If you look at January of 2026, so 1 year later, the ag trade deficit was 1.75 billion. So 6.5 a year ago, and then the following year, same month, we were down to 1.75. If you look at from the fourth quarter of 2025 to the present, so in those 5 months, our ag trade deficit, the monthly average has been under $1 billion. So, my fixation, I will admit it is a fixation, is get back to reciprocity in agriculture. We are a powerhouse of ag producers. There is no reason why we should have a spiraling agricultural trade deficit. And so we are really actively working to boost ag exports. Our trade deficit balance is a combination. We're importing a little less, we're exporting a lot more. And so getting that back to parity so that we're at least balanced, even better if we could have a little surplus as a cushion, but we really do want to get back to balanced and fair reciprocal relationships with our trading partners. So we'll continue to negotiate new agreements, and I don't see the 301 measures going away if they are imposed, given that the first Trump administration's 301 tariffs were maintained by the Biden administration, and they are based on addressing unfair trade practices. So until trading partners remove the unfair trade practices, which if they do so, then the 301 tariffs would go away. But until then, I think that's a good policy for longevity of the trade policy.
We can squeeze in one more. Do you want to go ahead? Up here, Logan? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. In your testimony to the Senate Finance Committee, you specifically referenced dairy, and you say countries are claiming, all this food security issues, and they're still importing billions of EU products. If you look at U.S. trade, we also import about 10 times more dairy products from the EU than we export to them. Some of that is barriers. Some of it is we like cheese from France. We like butter from Ireland. At the same time, the EU also negotiates all these market access for dairy in their trade agreements. And I don't remember seeing a whole lot of dairy in the trade deals. So how do we boost our exports with all these demand issues, as well as not actually really negotiating when we have the power to do so?
Thank you for that question. I have to say, au contraire, because if you look at the 9 agreements, this one of the most meaningful set of commitments that we have in each of the 9 existing agreements on reciprocal trade, we intend to have them in future agreements as well, is a commitment not to restrict market access due to the mere use of certain meat and cheese terms. And that gets at just what you're referencing with the EU approach to their own trade negotiations, where they get countries to commit to essentially giving EU member states a monopoly on certain cheese terms. So only Denmark can sell Havarti, for example. Only Greece can sell feta. And so each of the 9 agreements on reciprocal trade, those partners have committed to allowing US cheese manufacturers to continue to use those names. It's the variety of cheese, and that market access would not be restricted due to the use of those cheese names. So that is a huge shift, putting us on offense rather than defense in this space, and getting these meaningful commitments has been central in our negotiations. Other countries are giving us preferential access for dairy products. For instance, Malaysia gave us a very sizable duty-free TRQ for fluid milk. And so that opens the opportunity for the shelf-stable milk producers in California to ship their product to Malaysia duty-free. A number of countries are giving us preferential access on dairy. So that is absolutely top of mind. I will say every commodity is on our minds when we negotiate, because we do want to make sure each of the ag sectors sees tangible benefits out of these agreements. So whether it's specialty crops, dairy, pork, poultry, beef, row crops, soybeans, corn, et cetera, we want everybody to see that they're getting tangible wins out of these agreements. And that's really the only way to turn our current agricultural trade deficit back into a surplus.
Thank you. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you again, Ambassador Callahan, for sharing your time and insight with us on a really busy day in Washington. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.